They called it the air coffin, an iron airlock bolted to the caisson's throat. 5 men stepped in, breathing freely, the hatch slammed, and pressure crushed their skulls until their teeth ached. Then the inner door opened and they walked under the East River, alive. The paradox was vicious. On the Brooklyn Bridge, water didn't break most men. Air did. So why did a bridge need an air coffin at all? I'm James, the author of this channel. Before we follow one worker down there, you need one hard fact. The room under the river wasn't a cave. It was a wooden and iron box kept dry by compressed air. Air pumped in so hard it pushed back the river's weight. That same pressure is what turned an ordinary climb back to daylight into a gamble with a man's nerves, lungs, and spine. Eamon Doyle signed on because winter had already reached his kitchen. The hiring shed smelled of wet wool and cheap tobacco. Men stood with caps in their hands, eyes on the ledger like it was scripture. The foreman barely looked up. "Caisson pay is for caisson men," he said. "You follow the lock tender's time, you don't run in the lock, and you don't lie about your head." Nobody asked what happens if your head is already lying. The pit was a raw cut in the street. Timber walls sweated mud. A ladder dropped into darkness where the air turned warm and thick like breath trapped in a bottle. At the bottom waited the cylinder, riveted metal, 2 hatches, a wheel valve, and a man with a pocket watch who looked bored in the presence of danger. Inside the air coffin, shoulders touched. The outer hatch clanged shut with a sound that tightened Eamon's stomach. The tender cracked the valve. A hiss started, steady, patient. Then the pressure arrived in ugly steps. Eamon's ears popped so hard his eyes watered. His jaw throbbed. The air thickened until breathing felt like pulling through damp cloth. It tasted metallic, like pennies. One man swallowed and winced. Another stared straight down, jaw clenched, refusing to give panic any space. The inner hatch opened and heat rolled out. The caisson was not grand. It was work. Lamps burning steady in dim air. Men stripped down, skin slick, back shining. Picks and shovels biting into clay and boulders while muck tubes carried spoil away. Above their heads, beyond planks, bolts, and packed earth, the river pressed down with patient weight. Here's the context the men didn't get in training. The Brooklyn Tower caisson sat about 44 feet below high water, with air pressure around 21 pounds per square inch at its final depth. That doesn't sound like much until you remember your body was built for the pressure at street level. Eamon worked until sweat soaked his waistband and his lungs felt hot. The place had its own smell. Iron, clay, oil, and human breath recycled too many times. He tried not to think about the river. He thought about bread. A veteran named Callahan moved near him, quick and economical, like a man who saved effort for the part that mattered. "First day?" Callahan said. Eamon nodded. Callahan tapped the side of his skull once. "Listen to that. Coming up is where they get you." The bell ended the shift. Men flowed toward the lock with a relief that looked too hungry. In the air coffin again, the tender shut the inner hatch, checked his watch, and began bleeding off pressure. The hiss changed. Eamon felt it immediately. His joints prickled sharp as needles under skin. His stomach rolled. His ears screamed in a thin, relentless pain. "Don't move," Callahan muttered. "Let it out slow." The outer hatch opened. Cold air hit Eamon's face like an insult. Sunlight stabbed his eyes. For half a second he felt almost proud. Then a scream snapped the moment in half. A man ahead of them had dropped to his knees on the planks, gripping his legs as if they were trying to detach. His face went wet ash grey. He tried to speak and only sound came out. "My joints! My joints!" Then his legs stopped obeying him. Not a cramp, not fatigue, a clean, terrifying emptiness. He folded onto his side and clawed at his thighs, eyes wide with the realization that dying wasn't even the worst outcome. Somebody shoved a flask to his mouth. Whiskey. The old cure for new physics. He choked, coughed, gagged, and his body jerked like it was shorting out. A worker muttered. He rushed the lock, blaming the victim, because blaming a man is easier than blaming the job. The tender's mouth tightened. "I did what I was told." The foreman arrived, and before he looked at the injured man, he looked around, up toward the street, toward any face that didn't belong. "Get him inside," he snapped. "Off the boards." 2 labourers dragged the man by the arms. His heels left muddy streaks along the planks like someone underlining a warning. He kept whispering through clenched teeth, "Don't send me back down," as if the caisson had learned his name. If you're wondering how big this got, Accounts often cite 27 deaths across the bridge's construction, while some contemporaries believed the number was higher, and that's only the deaths people counted cleanly. Eamon walked home with his pay heavy in his pocket and his hands trembling. He held his daughter that night and listened to her breathing, small and steady, and he understood what the air coffin really was, a machine that let men work under a river, then punished them for returning. If you want the documented medical tally behind Caisson Disease on this project, and what changed when the work went deeper, subscribe and hit like. On the Manhattan shore, the pit looked the same from street level, a cut in the city, entimbered and wet, men moving like ants around a wound. The difference was felt, not seen, like stepping into a room where the air is already angry. Doyle didn't transfer because he was fearless. He transferred because the payboard said Manhattan in chalk, and the number beside it was the first number that made his wife stop counting bread slices out loud. Callahan found him in the line and didn't try to talk him out of it. He only said, "Down there, you don't get to be proud, you get to be slow." The air coffin on this side had the same 2 hatches, the same wheel valve, the same lock tender with a pocket watch. But when the tender cracked the valve, pressure climbed faster, heavier, like someone tightening a belt around Doyle's skull. His ears popped hard, his teeth ached. The air went thick and metallic until every breath felt dragged through wet cloth. A man behind him tried to clear his ears and gagged instead. Another man's nose started bleeding in a clean, thin stream. Nobody reacted, blood was normal, panic wasn't. Let me give you a number, because this is where the story stops being one unlucky scream on a plank walkway. The Manhattan caisson went down to about 78.5 feet below high water, and inside it the air pressure reached about 35 pounds per square inch. That difference in depth was the difference in outcomes. The inner hatch opened and heat rolled over them. The caisson felt tighter here, lower, louder, full of sweat and lamp smoke and the constant ring of iron on rock. Men worked stripped down, backs shining, moving spoiled toward the muck tubes with a rhythm that looked almost calm, until you watched their faces. Many wore the same set jaw, the same distant stare of men negotiating with their own nerves. The bell finally came and relief rose in the line like prayer. Then the real gamble began, in the lock. The tender watched his pocket watch like scripture. Seconds mattered, but nobody agreed on what they were worth. The hiss started. Pressure bled off. Doyle held the rail and stayed as still as a statue. He felt it anyway. First the prickling in the joints, then the nausea, then a hot buzzing in his hands as if his fingers had been dipped in nettles. Across from him, a broad man named Rourke smiled too wide and said, "See? Fine," as if speaking it made it true. The outer hatch opened. Cold air. Light. Rourke took 2 steps and folded. He didn't scream. He made a wet grunt like his breath had been punched out. He hit the boards and clawed at his thighs, eyes wide with the horrible discovery that his legs were still there, but they were no longer his. "Move him," the foreman snapped, already scanning the walkway, already thinking about who could be watching. 2 men dragged Rourke toward the shed. His heels left 2 muddy lines, neat as rails. "Back in the lock," someone muttered, and Doyle stared. Why? Callahan's answer was the kind of truth a job teaches you when science hasn't caught up. Sometimes pressure puts it back. Sometimes it buys you time. They shoved Rourke into the air coffin again. The tender spun the wheel. The hiss returned, but this time it sounded like punishment. Rourke's hands slapped at the door as it shut, not because he wanted out, but because he understood what going back in meant. You had to crawl into the thing that hurt you and pray it decided to spare you. A doctor arrived late, carrying a bag and wearing the expression of a man walking into a flood with a bucket. He knelt, asked about the ascent time, asked about pain, numbness, paralysis. He didn't look shocked. He looked tired. Here's the part the city didn't want in the headline. The bridge company hired a physician, Andrew H. Smith, and in the winter and spring of 1872 he recorded a surge of these cases. One well-cited tally has him treating 110 men between January 25th and May 31st, with 3 deaths attributed directly to the sickness. Doyle watched the doctor speak to the foreman. The doctor's lips moved fast, urgent. The foreman answered with a calm that didn't match the scene. Doyle caught only fragments as men jostled past. Pressure, ascent, slower. Then the foreman tipped his chin toward the clerk's shed and said something quieter. The doctor's shoulders dropped, just slightly, like a man realizing the argument he's making has an enemy that isn't medical. At dusk, the clerk didn't ask about Rourke. He slid coins across the counter and wrote in the ledger without looking up. Doyle leaned just enough to see one word on the line where Rourke's name had been earlier. Not bends, not caisson, not pressure, just incident. That single word could cover a man who crawled home on his elbows, a man who couldn't feel his hands for days, a man who died in his own bed and was never counted as a bridge death, because the bridge only counted what happened on its planks. He walked home with a heavier Manhattan pay in his pocket and a new thought he couldn't shake. The air coffin didn't just break bodies, it edited them. By the time Doyle stopped flinching at the hiss of the air coffin, the job found a new way to make him flinch. It made the damage look ordinary. On the Manhattan side, men started speaking in numbers instead of warnings. 78 feet. 35 pounds. They said it the way you'd say tomorrow's weather, because if you let the numbers sound like a threat, you'd never climb back into the lock. Records put the Manhattan caisson about 78.5 feet below high water, with internal pressure reaching roughly 35 pounds per square inch. Doyle didn't need the measurements to feel what they meant. He felt it in his teeth, an ache that arrived before the inner hatch even opened. He felt it in the way sweat started faster down there, the way breath came out heavy, the way men who joked on the street went quiet the moment the caisson door shut behind them. On a Tuesday that blurred into every other day, a man named Rourke, still not walking right from the last incident, came back to the line anyway. Not because he was healed, because he'd been told there was no pay if he stayed home. The ascent went wrong in a way that was almost polite. No panic, no stampede, just the tender shaving time while watching his pocket watch like it was a god. The hiss changed pitch. Doyle felt the needles in his joints and knew it was happening again. Rourke made it out, took one step and sat down hard as if the boards had turned to ice. "I can't feel," he whispered, blinking fast as if he could blink sensation back into his legs. Two men reached for him. The foreman shoved them aside with his shoulder. "Back in," he snapped. Rourke looked up, confused. No, they didn't give him dignity. They gave him a grip under each arm and dragged him toward the air coffin while his heels painted two muddy rails across the planks. Let me pause, because this is where the story sounds insane if you haven't heard how they tried to fight it. With decompression sickness, the pain and paralysis were often worst after coming up. Workers learned, sometimes the hard way, that going back under pressure could ease symptoms. Today we call it recompression. Back then, it was desperation with a wheel valve. Inside the air coffin, the tender slammed the hatch and spun the wheel like he was trying to erase what had happened by forcing time backward. Rourke's face went slick with sweat. His hands clawed at the iron rail. He didn't scream. He just breathed like a man drowning on dry land. When the hatch opened again and they pulled him out, he looked better for a minute. That was the cruelest part. He moved one foot, then the other. Men exhaled like a prayer had been answered. Then his eyes rolled and his body sagged. Not dead. Worse. Alive in a body that didn't obey. The foreman swore, low and furious, not at the sickness, but at the inconvenience of it. "Get him inside," he barked. "Now!" And that's how it went. The bridge didn't just crush men. It made them disappear behind doors. Doyle saw the doctor later, Smith, the company physician, move through the shed with a notebook and the posture of a man trying to outrun a wave. Records say that between late January and the end of May 1872, Smith treated 110 cases of what he termed Caisson Disease, and 3 workers died in that span from it. What the records can't capture is what Doyle watched with his own eyes. How many lesser cases never reached a doctor at all, because men learned to hide symptoms to stay on the roster. By afternoon, the caisson had taken another kind of bite, not in bones, through fear. A runner came down the ladder with a message that snapped every head toward him. Smoke. For a second, Doyle didn't understand why the word hit so hard. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant oxygen. And the whole job depended on pumping air into a sealed space under a river. Then Callahan, standing near the ladder, muttered something that sounded like a superstition. "Don't talk about the candle," Doyle stared. "What candle?" Callahan didn't answer right away. He only looked down the shaft like he was looking into memory. Here's the historical reality. In December 1870, an unguarded candle ignited roof timbers inside the caisson, and the compressed air drove the fire deep into hidden spaces. It resisted efforts to stop it until fireboats and the Brooklyn Fire Department flooded the entire caisson for days. That wasn't folklore. That was the kind of incident that teaches men to fear a match more than a flood. Down on the Manhattan side, the smoke that day didn't become a full inferno, but it didn't need to. It only needed to remind everyone what a sealed room plus forced air could become. The foreman's voice cracked across the pit. "No open flame," he shouted, "no lantern tricks. Nobody lights anything, you hear me?" Men nodded fast. Some didn't even know they'd been holding their breath. And then, like everything else, the fear got managed. A supervisor walked the walkway above the caisson entrance and spoke to the few workers who'd been closest to the smoke. Not kindly, not violently, just firmly, like a man tightening a rope. "If anyone asks," he said, "it was a ventilation issue. Nothing more. Nobody panicked." He didn't say fire. He didn't say caisson. He didn't say air coffin. He said the kind of words that travelled well into newspapers. That night Doyle went home with his pay and didn't feel richer. He felt purchased. At the table, he unfolded a scrap of paper and stared at it until his wife noticed. She didn't ask what it was. She only watched him sharpen a pencil stub with a knife and start writing. Slow and careful. Names first, then dates he could remember, then a single repeated phrase in the margin like a warning he was carving for himself. The air coffin. The sickest thing the bridge taught them wasn't pain. It was routine. By July, the Manhattan pit ran like a factory line. Men down, men up, the lock tender's pocket watch deciding whose spine stayed intact. The new hands still joked on the street. The old hands saved their breath for the hiss. On a humid afternoon, the foreman announced another push. Shorter breaks, faster turnarounds. No time lost in the lock. He said it like he was talking about moving barrels, not moving human bodies through pressure. The men understood what that meant. Nobody argued. Arguing didn't slow the watch. Inside the air coffin, the chamber filled shoulder to shoulder. The hatch clanged shut. The valve cracked. Pressure climbed. Ears popped. Teeth ached. That thick metallic air returned. Pennies and sweat and oil, until every breath felt borrowed. When the inner hatch opened, the caisson heat took them again. Lamps steady. Picks biting. Mud and rock and the dull, constant struggle to steal space from the river. Then the bell. Up in the lock, the tender bled pressure off too quickly. Not dramatically, just enough to shave seconds and pretend it was nothing. The hiss changed pitch. A thinner, faster leak. The first man out stumbled, laughing too loud, as if he could outrun physics with noise. He made it 3 steps before his knees buckled. He didn't fall cleanly. He dropped like a puppet whose strings had been cut, arms flailing once, then going slack. He tried to speak. His mouth worked. Only breath came out. His hands clawed at his thighs. Then he slapped the planks beside him. Hard. Angry, like the wood had stolen his legs. A few of the crew moved toward him, instinctive. The foreman cut them off. "Inside," he snapped. "Off the boards." They dragged the man toward the shed. His boots drew 2 muddy lines behind him. He kept whispering over and over, "I can't feel it. I can't feel it." Like sensation was a tool he'd dropped somewhere and couldn't find again. Somebody muttered the old desperate fix. Back under, back in the lock. Nobody liked saying it out loud, but they'd all seen it. Men shoved back into pressure because sometimes pressure eased the symptoms. It sounded insane until you'd watched a body fail in open air and then steady, briefly, after recompression. The injured man looked at the air coffin like it was an animal waiting to bite him twice. They shoved him in anyway. He came out minutes later, sweating and trembling, eyes wet, jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped. For a moment he could stand. Men exhaled. Then his face drained of colour. His legs folded again. This time he didn't even try to catch himself. He just stopped being a man who could hold his own weight. That was the moment the crew's fear turned into something else, something colder. Because it wasn't one unlucky ascent, it was the system. Let me step out for 1 minute, because there's a reason the men started believing the bridge itself was editing them. The company's own physician, Andrew H. Smith, was brought in during the worst stretch of caisson sickness. In a 5-month span, late January through the end of May 1872, records credit him with treating 110 cases of what he called Caisson Disease, and 3 men died from it in that same period. That's not rumour. That's a tally. Back on the planks, none of those numbers mattered to the foreman. The only thing that mattered was what the street could see. "Move him!" he ordered again, same words, same tone, as if repeating it could keep the bridge clean. That evening, The sick man was gone from the walkway, gone from the line, and by the next morning a new hand was standing where he'd stood. The roster swallowed people without chewing. Doyle started watching the paperwork the way he watched the lock tender's hands. He saw the clerk's pen move. He saw the word they used again and again, incident. A word wide enough to cover paralysis, vomiting, a man crawling home, a man dying later in bed with no bridge official present to count it. He also heard a rumour that didn't sound like a rumour because it carried the weight of fear. The engineers had probed below the Manhattan caisson and found bedrock deeper than expected. The pressure would have to go higher, more men would come up broken, and then, quietly, almost unbelievably, the job blinked. Washington Roebling halted the sinking. Not because the river won, but because the risk did. At roughly 78.5 feet down and around 35 pounds per square inch, he decided the sand beneath was firm enough and ordered the caisson filled with concrete instead of chasing bedrock another 30 feet. On the site, the order didn't feel like mercy. It felt like a calculation. Men had already paid the price to get them that far. Stopping didn't refund the bodies. The foreman framed it as progress. "We're done down there," he said, like he was announcing a holiday. "Concrete goes in. We move on." But the men didn't cheer. They watched each other's faces, counting the ones who were missing. Doyle went home and pulled up a loose floorboard. He took out his paper scraps and unfolded them with careful hands. Names, dates, notes in pencil, who collapsed, who never came back, who left the site walking and returned weeks later carried. He added the sick man from that afternoon, if not his full name, then the one the crew used. He wrote it anyway, because a nickname was still more honest than incident. There's a reason these stories get smoothed over. Even the death count gets debated. One widely cited estimate says 27 men died during construction, while some contemporary voices argued it could have been closer to 40. And here's the cover-up angle that matters. You don't need a conspiracy to erase people. You just need a project that rewards silence, a ledger that prefers vague words, and a city that wants a monument more than it wants the truth of how the monument was made. Doyle didn't smash anything. He didn't expose anyone in court. He wasn't that kind of man, and the bridge wasn't that kind of machine. He just kept the names. Because if the air coffin could steal a man's legs in 10 seconds, it could steal his place in history even faster. I'm going to end with this. If you want to be part of one community that tells the real cost behind monuments, subscribe so we stay together here. Hit like if you think these stories deserve daylight, and comment, if the pay could keep your family warm. Would you step into the air coffin knowing what it does on the way back up?